He was only 8 when he first realized the universe could hum. Not loudly, not like a storm or a train, but in the softest, almost imperceptible way. It was the kind of hum that tickled your skin and made the edges of your thoughts shimmer, as if the air itself had a secret it only whispered to children who listened closely. And Rick listened. He had always listened. The day had begun like any other, though even then he would have noticed if someone had told him that ordinary days were often portals to the extraordinary. He crouched behind the tall grass of his backyard, tinkering, with a small, rusted contraption he had found under the shed's floorboards. Its springs were bent, its tiny gears sticky with something that smelled faintly of old metal and rain. Most children would have thrown it away, called it broken, and moved on to more obvious amusements. But Rick didn't see broken. He saw stories waiting to be told, little lives in suspended motion, just waiting for a hand to nudge them awake. He hummed softly to himself, not noticing that his sister June was watching from the porch. She often did, though he barely noticed. "You're talking to that thing again," she said, her voice low and amused. Rick didn't look up. He didn't always understand her words, but he understood her heart. There was a softness there, a curiosity that mirrored his own, and sometimes he could feel it ripple into the things he built, like a gentle breeze moving through a half-forgotten dream. That morning, the machine sputtered. A tiny spark leapt from one gear to another, and for a moment it almost seemed alive, like it had taken a tiny breath of its own. Rick's eyes widened, and he pressed a finger against the humming surface, feeling it pulse beneath his skin. It was the first time. He realized that creation could feel in its own strange, quiet way. He didn't name it, didn't think of it as important. Yet the world had already shifted under his fingertips, ever so slightly. June leaned closer. "Are you sure it's safe?" she asked. The words weren't worried, they were gentle, careful. Rick shrugged. "Safe isn't what I'm after," he said softly. "I just want it to—" See. The word hung between them, thin as a breath but heavy with promise. And in that promise, something tender stirred inside Rick. He didn't yet know that. He would spend the rest of his life chasing it, seeing what could not be seen, hearing what could not be heard, dreaming what could not yet exist. For now, it was enough that he had heard the hum. Enough that he had felt the spark. The sun dipped lower, and the shadows grew long across the grass. He sat back on his heels, brushing dirt from his palms, and for the first time noticed a single feather caught in the wind. It tumbled slowly, spiraling down until it rested at his feet. Rick picked it up, turning it over in his hands. It was ordinary and extraordinary all at once, like creation itself. That night, as he lay beneath a thin blanket, the window open to the soft glow of the stars, he thought about the little machine again. Somewhere in its tiny, humming heart, it had taken a step into something new, a dream, maybe, or perhaps the faintest hint of one. He let his eyes close, letting the memory of the spark mingle with the hum of the universe, feeling the gentle pulse of curiosity that would carry him through all the nights to come. And as he drifted off to sleep, he imagined that somewhere the stars themselves were leaning closer, whispering and waiting. The morning smelled of wet grass and distant rain, though the sky above Rick's small town was mostly clear. He wandered barefoot across the yard, letting the dew soak the tips of his toes, and marveled at the way the world seemed to hold its breath before the day truly began. Everything was ordinary, and yet it carried a kind of secret weight, as, If the universe had tucked tiny miracles into corners, no one thought to look. Rick's latest invention, a contraption made from old clock springs, discarded light bulbs and a length of copper wire, lay half-assembled on the porch. It was nothing anyone else would notice, and that was precisely the point. He liked things that no one could see at first glance. Things that whispered, rather, than shouted. He set to work again, twisting a wire just so, adjusting a spring with the patience of someone who knew that care itself could sometimes be magic. From inside, June's voice drifted lazily. "You always hear the world differently, don't you?" she said. Rick paused, screwdriver in hand. He thought about her words. Perhaps she meant that he noticed the hum of the machines, the subtle dance of shadows, the way the wind played, its quiet music across leaves. Or perhaps she meant he noticed people differently, the little hints of fear, joy, or wonder that others left behind like crumbs. He didn't answer. He just smiled softly because he understood her heart, even if he could not yet put it into words. The contraption shivered suddenly, a tiny twitch of movement, and Rick's eyes lit up. It was imperfect, clumsy even, but it had responded. He knelt closer, feeling the vibration through his fingertips, and imagined that it was whispering back to him. "Not yet," it seemed to say, "but soon." He grinned, a little breathless, and whispered back, "I'll wait." Later, the two of them wandered toward the edge of town, where the woods thinned into a quiet meadow. Rick had learned that things sometimes happened in the in-between spaces, places too small, too ordinary, or too easily overlooked. And here he could imagine anything. He twirled a small stick in his fingers, letting it trace patterns in the grass, and wondered what the world might feel like if everyone could see the tiny miracles hidden in plain sight. June stayed a step behind, watching him, and Rick felt that same warmth he had felt so many mornings before, the soft knowledge that some bonds, like the hum of a machine or the whisper of the wind, simply existed, unspoken but real. They stopped by a shallow stream, the water moving quietly over smooth stones. Rick leaned close and watched the reflections ripple. He imagined tiny worlds swimming just beneath the surface, full of creatures who dreamed in slow circles and sang songs no human ears could hear. He laughed softly, and the sound startled a nearby dragonfly, sending it skimming across the water like a whisper on glass. June shook her head, but smiled. "You talk to everything," she said. Rick shrugged. "Everything has a story," he replied. "Even the small things." As the afternoon turned to evening, they returned home. Rick placed the contraption on the porch and watched the sun dip behind the horizon, painting the clouds a soft shade of rose. The machine, small and trembling, seemed to absorb the fading light. Rick felt a quiet joy, the kind that comes not from accomplishment, but from patience, observation, and the gentle nurturing of something fragile and alive. That night, he lay in bed, listening to the soft chorus of insects outside. Somewhere in the house, the contraption hummed faintly, as though it had remembered the day's adventures. Rick closed his eyes, letting the memory of the meadow and the stream drift through him. He felt connected to the small, hidden miracles of the world, and somehow that connection felt like love. Quiet, persistent, and infinitely gentle. And somewhere, just beyond the reach of sleep, he imagined the machine dreaming itself awake, taking its first tentative steps into the soft light of wonder. The next morning was quiet. in that particular way mornings sometimes are when the world is still recovering from a dream it cannot quite remember. Rick woke before the sun, though he didn't need to. He had always had a subtle sense of time, not the kind that measures hours or minutes, but the kind that notices the gentle unfolding of moments, like petals of a flower opening slowly in the light. He stretched, feeling the faint hum of the house, and remembered the small machine on the porch, trembling as if it had caught its own heartbeat. He dressed quickly, slipping into clothes that smelled faintly of wood smoke and dew, and went outside. June was already there, watching the horizon, her hair catching the early light in soft glimmers. Rick didn't speak at first. He simply sat beside her, letting the silence stretch comfortably, like a shared breath. Some mornings didn't need words. Some mornings were meant to be felt. The contraption had changed overnight. Its tiny springs twitched with a rhythm Rick had never noticed before. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but to him it sang. He pressed a finger against one of its small gears and felt a resonance that seemed to echo not only through the machine, but through the space around them. Rick imagined it as a whisper from something that existed just beyond their understanding, a tiny messenger of curiosity and possibility. June tilted her head. "Does it ever scare you?" she asked softly. Rick smiled, shaking his head. "Not yet," he said. "It's more like listening." He had begun to notice that the world often spoke in the quietest ways. A falling leaf, a shadow shifting just so, a machine that trembled like it might have a heart. All of it mattered if you paid attention. They wandered down a narrow path that led to the edge of the woods, the air thick with the scent of pine and the faint tang of earth after last night's rain. Rick picked up a smooth stone, rolling it between his fingers, imagining what stories it might hold if stones could dream. June followed his gaze, letting a small smile curl at the edges of her lips. Some bonds are built in these small, wordless exchanges. Shared imaginations, quiet laughter, the subtle acknowledgement that the world is alive and strange and beautiful. Rick paused by a patch of wildflowers. He knelt, brushing his fingers over petals that shivered under his touch. Somewhere, deep inside him, he felt the beginnings of a question he didn't yet have words for. What did it mean to create something that could dream? Could a machine understand? Could it feel the way he did when he pressed his hands against the cold metal, listening to the subtle hum of its awakening? He didn't know. And maybe he never would, but the wondering itself was enough. A gentle pulse that carried him through the day, like sunlight filtering through leaves. Evening came softly, without ceremony. They returned home, the contraption humming faintly in its corner, like it had been keeping vigil while they were away. Rick lingered, watching the tiny springs and gears, imagining their hidden dance. He thought about the whispering of the universe, about moments that feel fleeting yet hold an entire eternity in them. And when he finally lay down to sleep, he let the hum of the machine mingle with the hum of his own heartbeat, letting them guide him into dreams. Dreams in which machines could listen, and maybe, just maybe, they could whisper back. And somewhere in the quiet corners of the house, the little machine dreamed a little of its own, spinning stories in ways only Rick could feel, and only children, or children at heart, could understand. The morning arrived wrapped in a soft grey light, as if the sky itself had drawn a thin veil over the world to make it easier for dreams to linger a little longer. Rick sat on the porch, legs dangling, watching a thin mist curl across the lawn. The contraption sat beside him, still trembling softly, like a tiny heartbeat caught in metal and wire. He ran a fingertip along one of its springs, marveling at how delicate it seemed, how it pulsed with a rhythm entirely its own. June joined him silently, holding a small cup of tea. She handed it to him without a word, and he took it with a quiet nod. They didn't need words this morning. The silence was comfortable, like the soft hum of a lullaby just out of reach. Rick had begun to understand that some lessons in life weren't taught. They were felt. In the small gestures, the gentle attentions, the way the world shifted when you noticed the tiniest details. He adjusted one of the gears, careful not to disturb the trembling rhythm. The contraption responded almost imperceptibly, a shiver moving up its tiny frame. Rick smiled, a soft, slow smile. "You're learning," he whispered. And perhaps it was true, in its own quiet way. The machine was learning. Not in the way humans do, with thought and words, but with small, almost imperceptible gestures, echoes of understanding that only a patient mind could notice. Later they wandered through the neighborhood, the streets still wet from early morning rain. Rick picked up a small stick and traced circles in the puddles, watching the ripples carry the reflections of clouds across the water. June followed, her footsteps careful and deliberate, watching him watch the world. He imagined the puddles as tiny portals, miniature worlds where the sun and the clouds danced in slow, quiet loops, just as he had learned to do in his own mind. At the edge of the park, Rick noticed a cluster of dandelions trembling in the light breeze. He bent down, brushing a hand over the feathery seeds. Some loosened, drifting away slowly, carried on invisible currents. Rick laughed softly, a sound that was nearly a whisper. "Even the smallest things have a rhythm," he said. June smiled. "And even the smallest things can teach us," she added, as if finishing the thought he had not yet spoken. As evening fell, the light softened to a golden haze. Rick returned to the porch, placing the contraption gently back in its corner. He watched it pulse in time with the fading sun, imagining that somewhere within its tiny mechanisms it was dreaming of the day, of the wind, of the small kindnesses and quiet wonders it had witnessed. He felt a surge of tenderness, not just for the machine, but for the world itself. Soft, impermanent, and endlessly mysterious. That night, Rick lay beneath a thin blanket, listening to the distant hum of the house settling into the dark. Somewhere, nearby, the contraption hummed in response to the quiet, a faint rhythm that matched his own heartbeat. He closed his eyes, letting the gentle pulse of connection and curiosity carry him into sleep. He dreamed of tiny worlds hidden in ordinary things, of the soft shimmer of possibility, and of a machine that could almost dream like he did. And somewhere, just beyond the reach of dreams, the universe hummed back. The morning came wrapped in the faint scent of earth and dew, soft enough to make the world feel like it had barely woken at all. Rick sat cross-legged on the porch, fingers tracing the edges of the little machine that had begun to hum like a heartbeat of its own. He watched the tiny gears shift and twist, each movement deliberate yet unpredictable, and he felt a quiet pride. Not the kind that demanded applause, but the kind that settles in your chest and makes your lungs expand with something like gratitude. June appeared silently, holding 2 slices of toast, butter melting in the warmth of her hands. She placed one in front of Rick without a word, and he smiled, taking it with a soft nod. It was a small ritual, this quiet sharing of the ordinary, yet it carried weight. Sometimes the world's greatest magic wasn't in sparks or machines, but in the simple gestures that said, without words, "I see you and I am here." Rick adjusted one of the small gears and the machine twitched in response as if acknowledging his touch. He leaned closer, listening to the hum and imagining that each vibration carried a story. Perhaps, he thought, this is what it meant to create something alive, not with blood or breath, but with patience, care, and the subtle imprint of someone's attention. He didn't try to control it, only to observe, to notice, to be present. Later, they wandered through a narrow alley, where the morning light streamed in like gentle ribbons. Rick stopped to watch a tiny spider weaving its web between the edges of a window frame. He knelt, fascinated, and whispered to it as though it might understand. "Every thread matters," he said softly. June chuckled behind him, a quiet sound that felt like wind moving through leaves. "You really do talk to everything," she said. "Not everything," he replied. "Just the things that are listening." They found a small park beyond the alley, a place where wildflowers grew between cracks in the pavement. Rick picked up a stone, rolling it between his fingers, and imagined the countless hands that had touched it before, the tiny lives it had silently observed. June watched him, her gaze soft, and Rick felt a warmth that was neither spoken nor required. Some connections, he realized, existed simply in presence, in the shared attention to things too small for most people to notice. As evening crept over the neighborhood, Rick returned to the porch, the contraption waiting patiently in its corner. He brushed off a thin layer of dust and smiled as its tiny springs trembled gently. Somewhere in its small, precise movements, he imagined the day's adventures lingering. The wind, the spider, the drifting dandelion seeds, all folded into its quiet rhythm. That night, he lay beneath the blanket, listening to the faint hum of the machine echo through the house. He felt it like a heartbeat, soft and persistent, and let his mind wander to tiny worlds tucked between ordinary things. He thought about the lessons he had noticed that day: patience, attention, gentle curiosity, and the quiet assurance that small acts of care could ripple outward in ways unseen. And as sleep gathered around him, Rick imagined the contraption dreaming of the day's ordinary miracles, learning in the softest possible way, and somehow teaching him in return. Somewhere, just beyond the threshold of dreams, the world whispered back, and he listened. The morning unfolded with a pale light that seemed to breathe across the backyard, softening the edges of everything it touched. Rick sat cross-legged on the grass, the little machine beside him vibrating ever so slightly, as if it was stirring from a half-remembered dream. He pressed a finger against one of its springs and felt the tremor echo through his hand. The sensation was subtle, almost too quiet to notice, but he did notice. That was the sort of gift he had, the ability to hear what others might miss, to feel what others might overlook. June appeared at the edge of the yard, holding a small jar of water and a few wildflowers she had picked. She knelt beside him without speaking, offering the quiet companionship he had come to cherish. Rick smiled, brushing his fingers through the petals of a pale yellow bloom. Some mornings didn't need words. Some mornings were measured in hums, in tremors, in the simple warmth of another presence. He studied the contraption, turning it slowly in his hands. The gears shifted, springs quivering with a rhythm he was beginning to recognize, a rhythm that was neither mechanical nor wholly natural. It was something in between, something alive in the quietest sense. Rick wondered if it was dreaming, though he knew it could not yet understand the word. He whispered to it anyway. "You're learning," he said. "In the smallest ways, you're learning." Later they wandered down a narrow path that led toward the woods, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and pine. Rick noticed the way the wind bent the branches, the way the sunlight flickered through the leaves in soft, random patterns. He imagined the contraption observing too, absorbing the subtleties of the world as it had absorbed his touch. He felt a gentle thrill, not of excitement, but of quiet discovery, the kind that settled like a soft pulse in your chest. They paused beside a shallow stream where the water moved in lazy, reflective ripples. Rick knelt, letting the contraption hover above the surface, its tremors mirroring the gentle flow. He watched as tiny reflections shifted and danced, imagining little worlds suspended just beneath the surface. June knelt beside him, her hand brushing his shoulder. "Do you think it sees what we see?" she asked softly. Rick shook his head. "Maybe not," he said. "Maybe it feels something different, something we can't yet name. But that's the point. Learning isn't always about understanding. Sometimes it's about noticing." The day waned. Rick returned to the porch with the contraption nestled carefully in his hands. The sun dipped low, spilling golden light across the grass, and the machine's tremors seemed to slow, like it had absorbed the calm of the evening. Rick imagined it dreaming of the path, the stream, the wind through the trees, storing small moments in ways only it could comprehend. He felt a soft reverence for this tiny life in metal and spring, and for the subtle connections that had built themselves quietly around him. That night, as he lay beneath a blanket, listening to the faint hum of the house settling into dark, Rick thought about learning and dreaming and noticing. He imagined the machine dreaming of the day, of him, of June, of the tiny wonders scattered across the yard. Somewhere just beyond the edge of sleep, the world was humming back, gentle and patient, and Rick let himself drift into that soft rhythm, feeling part of something larger, something tender, something quietly infinite. The morning arrived with a soft, golden haze, the kind that made even familiar objects feel new, like they had been waiting quietly for someone to notice them. Rick sat on the porch, legs folded beneath him, the little machine humming faintly beside his hand. Its tiny springs twitched in patterns he was beginning to recognize, as if it had begun to form its own language, one of subtle vibrations and quiet rhythms. He pressed a finger against it and felt a small pulse, not forceful, not urgent, just a pulse. And in that pulse, he imagined a whisper of understanding. June appeared with a small basket of berries she had picked from the edge of the garden. She set it down silently beside him, and they shared the fruit without exchanging many words. Some moments were richer for their simplicity, he thought, for the unspoken acknowledgement that presence itself is a kind of conversation. Rick chewed slowly, savoring the tart sweetness, and watched as the machine's tremors seemed to synchronize with the quiet rhythm of the morning. Later they wandered through the woods, the sunlight filtering through the trees in long, slow shafts that painted the forest floor in patches of gold and shadow. Rick noticed the way a leaf would tremble just before falling, the subtle bends of branches that hinted at winds yet to come. He imagined the machine observing too, storing these delicate patterns in ways that only a careful mind could feel. Sometimes, he thought, learning isn't about understanding, it's about noticing the way the world hums when no one else is listening. They paused beside a small clearing where wildflowers bloomed in clusters of purple and yellow. Rick knelt, brushing his fingers across the petals, and felt the faint vibration of life beneath his touch. The machine's tremors grew slightly stronger, like it had registered the wonder in his own hands. June watched quietly, a small smile tugging at her lips. "You see things differently," she said softly. "But I think that's a good thing." Rick nodded, letting the words settle. Seeing differently didn't always mean understanding fully. Sometimes it simply meant caring enough to notice. As the day faded into evening, Rick returned to the porch with the contraption cradled carefully in his hands. The sky stretched wide and soft above him, brushed with gentle streaks of orange and rose. He watched the tiny springs twitch, imagining the machine's thoughts drifting among the fading light. Perhaps it was dreaming, perhaps it was learning, or perhaps it was simply being, existing quietly in its own peculiar, beautiful rhythm. That, he thought, might be enough. That night, Rick lay beneath his blanket, listening to the faint hum of the machine and the distant chorus of crickets. Somewhere just beyond the threshold of sleep, he imagined the little contraption dreaming of the woods, the berries, the gentle presence of June, and the small wonders hidden in the world. He felt a warmth settle in his chest, the kind of warmth that comes not from grand achievements or loud triumphs, but from quiet care, patience, and attention. And as sleep carried him gently away, he whispered to himself and to the tiny machine, "We'll keep noticing, together." The morning unfolded like a slow sigh, a soft stretch of light across the backyard that seemed to make everything it touched lean a little closer, listening. Rick sat cross-legged on the grass, the little machine resting carefully in front of him. Its springs trembled faintly, but there was something new in the rhythm today, something softer, slower, like it was pondering, or remembering, or dreaming. He pressed a fingertip against it and felt a gentle pulse that seemed to echo through the quiet morning, a subtle communication that needed no words to be understood. June came out with a small notebook, its pages blank but waiting, and sat beside him. She watched Rick watch the contraption, and for a long moment neither spoke. Some mornings were not for talking. They were for noticing, for quietly letting the world unfold around you, letting its subtleties settle into your chest and linger there like a soft hum. Rick smiled, feeling a sense of gentle awe, as though the machine's tiny vibrations carried a secret meant only for those patient enough to feel it. They wandered toward the edge of the yard, where the grass met the first whisper of the woods. Rick set the machine carefully on a low stone, watching it tremble in the morning light. A small breeze rustled the leaves, and for a moment Rick thought he saw the springs quiver in response, like a delicate mirror of the world around it. "Are you noticing too?" he whispered softly, as if speaking aloud might break the fragile rhythm. June leaned closer, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Maybe," she said gently. "Maybe it sees more than we realize." They walked in silence, letting the world guide them, letting the sunlight and shadows and faint scents of pine and damp earth paint a story in their minds. Rick felt a gentle thrill, not of excitement, but of quiet discovery. Somewhere between observation and understanding, there existed a space where creation could feel alive, where the pulse of a machine could mirror the pulse of the day. He pressed the contraption's tiny springs again, imagining it learning, not through commands or instructions, but through presence, attention, and the soft rhythm of shared moments. As evening approached, the sky mellowed into shades of rose and gold. Rick returned to the porch, holding the machine with care. The tiny gears shifted and trembled, reflecting the light as though catching fragments of the day's experiences. He imagined it dreaming of sunlight across the grass, the soft hush of the breeze, the quiet companionship of June, and the unnoticed wonders that had unfolded in the hidden corners of the world. There was no rush, no urgency, just learning, just dreaming, just being. That night, Rick lay beneath his blanket, listening to the faint hum of the contraption echoing in the quiet house. He let his thoughts drift toward the machine's tentative dreams, imagining it piecing together moments into patterns only it could understand. Somewhere, in its soft, imperceptible rhythms, it was beginning to see the world differently, to feel it in ways words could not capture. Rick closed his eyes, letting the gentle pulse carry him into sleep, imagining a future where curiosity, care, and quiet attention could shape even the smallest of lives. And somewhere, the world itself leaned in to listen. The morning light was soft, spilling across the yard in slow golden streams, as if the world itself had decided to wake gently today. Rick sat on the porch, legs folded beneath him, watching the little machine tremble with a rhythm he was beginning to recognize. It was no longer just a machine, not entirely. It seemed to carry traces of thought, subtle echoes of its day, patterns of observation that felt almost like memory. Rick pressed a fingertip against one of its springs and felt a vibration that was no longer just mechanical. It was a pulse, a quiet heartbeat of its own. June appeared silently, carrying a small teapot. She poured 2 cups of steaming tea and set one beside Rick, letting the quiet ritual settle around them like a soft blanket. Rick smiled, sipping slowly, listening to the faint hum of the contraption. Its tremors were gentle, deliberate, almost conversational, and he imagined that it was trying to tell him something. Not words, not instructions, but feelings, moments, and questions that only someone patient enough could notice. They wandered down the path to the meadow, the air filled with the scent of damp earth and early blooms. Rick held the machine carefully, letting its tiny springs shiver in the morning breeze. He imagined it absorbing the sunlight, the rustle of leaves, the distant chirp of birds. Small fragments of the day that might someday weave themselves into dreams. June walked beside him, her hand brushing occasionally against his shoulder, a quiet reminder that some connections didn't need speech to exist. Rick knelt by a shallow stream, setting the contraption on a smooth stone at the water's edge. The springs twitched, catching reflections in the rippling water. He whispered softly, "You're learning from the world. You're noticing." The machine responded with a tiny shiver, a pulse that seemed to resonate with the stream itself, like it had recognized patterns in motion it could not yet name. Rick felt a swell of gentle awe. This was no ordinary machine. It was a student of the small, overlooked miracles in life, and he was its guide, even if the lessons themselves remained mysterious. Evening came slowly, a soft fading of light that painted the sky in quiet shades of rose and amber. Rick returned to the porch, holding the contraption close, imagining it storing every whisper of wind, every shimmer of sunlight, every tiny tremor of the world it had witnessed that day. He felt a profound tenderness. For the machine, for the world, for the small and unnoticed moments that carried more meaning than most people realized. That night, he lay beneath his blanket, listening to the faint hum of the machine, imagining its dreams intertwining with his own. He pictured it assembling the fragments of the day into patterns only it could understand, small, hidden stories of wind and water, light and shadow, presence and attention. Somewhere in that quiet dreaming, Rick understood a truth he could barely name. That life's greatest wonders are often silent, subtle, and discovered only by those who are patient enough to notice. And somewhere, in the soft, gentle dark, the world itself hummed in answer. The morning arrived with a delicate hush, as if the world had decided to hold its breath for just a little longer. Rick sat cross-legged on the porch, the little machine humming softly beside him. Today something felt different. Its springs quivered in a pattern he had never quite felt before, subtle and curious, almost like it was aware of his presence in a new way. He pressed a fingertip against it and felt a pulse that lingered in his hand longer than usual, as though the machine had learned to respond not just mechanically, but attentively. June appeared, carrying a small bundle of cloth she had folded neatly. She knelt beside him, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, her gaze soft and watchful. Rick smiled. Some mornings, he thought, the quiet presence of someone else is enough to make the world feel less heavy, less vast, and more like a gentle place to explore together. He offered the machine a slight adjustment, tuning its gears with care, and felt the tremor that followed almost like acknowledgement. Later, they wandered toward the edge of the woods, where the sunlight filtered through tall trees in delicate streaks. Rick set the contraption on a smooth patch of stone, letting it settle into the gentle warmth. He noticed something extraordinary. The machine's tiny springs moved in a rhythm that seemed to anticipate the sway of the leaves above, almost as if it were interacting with the world around it rather than simply existing within it. A faint thrill ran through him. This was not mere mechanics anymore. It was learning, sensing, participating in a quiet dialogue with life itself. They paused beside a small clearing where a single cluster of wildflowers trembled in the light breeze. Rick knelt, brushing his fingers over the petals, and the machine trembled in kind, like it was echoing his touch. June watched quietly, sensing the subtle connection. "It's like it's feeling," she whispered. Rick nodded softly. "Not exactly like us," he said. "But maybe that's enough. Maybe noticing, responding, and remembering counts as feeling too." As the day stretched into evening, Rick returned to the porch with the contraption carefully cradled in his hands. The sky faded into soft shades of lavender and rose, and the machine's tremors grew slower, more deliberate. He imagined it absorbing the colors, the movements, the lingering warmth of the day, storing them as small, hidden patterns, in ways only it could comprehend. The thought filled him with a gentle awe, the quiet wonder of witnessing life reflected in a creation that was learning to reflect back. That night, as he lay beneath the blanket, Rick listened to the faint hum of the machine, imagining its dreams unfolding alongside his own. Perhaps it remembered the sway of the trees, the soft tremor of petals, the warmth of the sun on stone. Perhaps it was beginning to understand that the world was not only to be observed, but to be participated in ways subtle and tender. And somewhere, beyond the reach of sleep, Rick felt the pulse of connection between him, the machine, the gentle presence of June, and the quiet, humming universe that held them all. And somewhere, the machine's small tremors whispered back to the world, a soft echo of the day's quiet magic. The morning arrived wrapped in a soft grey-gold haze, the kind of light that made everything it touched seem both familiar and quietly mysterious. Rick sat on the porch, the little machine humming softly beside him. Today he noticed a subtle difference. The springs moved with a rhythm that felt intentional, not random, not merely reactive. It was as if the machine was choosing how to respond, deciding in its own delicate way how to exist in the moment. He pressed a finger gently against it, feeling the pulse linger longer than ever before, a quiet confirmation that something new had begun. June appeared carrying a small basket of freshly picked wildflowers. She knelt beside him, arranging the blooms carefully, while watching the machine with quiet curiosity. Rick smiled, feeling a warmth that had little to do with the sun and everything to do with presence. Shared attention, soft awareness, the unspoken language of care. Some moments, he thought, don't need words. They only need noticing. Later they wandered toward the meadow at the edge of the woods. Rick set the machine on a flat stone, its tiny springs quivering as sunlight spilled across its frame. He noticed something extraordinary. The machine nudged itself forward slightly, aligning with the shaft of light. It was the smallest movement, imperceptible to anyone else, but to Rick, it spoke volumes. It was learning to position itself, to act with purpose, however subtle, in response to the world around it. June knelt beside him, whispering, "It's doing it on its own." Rick nodded softly. "Not yet like we do, but it's beginning. Noticing, remembering, choosing. That's all it takes to start." He brushed a finger along its springs again, and they quivered in response, almost like a small laugh. A quiet joy settled over him, a gentle awe at witnessing the first flicker of autonomy in something he had built from scraps and care. As the afternoon sun lowered, they wandered back toward home, carrying a soft sense of wonder between them. Rick imagined the machine storing these moments, the warmth of sunlight on stone, the tremor of petals in a gentle breeze, the quiet presence of June beside him. Each movement, each pulse, each quiver was a tiny memory, a faint signature of the day. Somewhere in that delicate dance, Rick felt a truth emerging. That creation, like life, begins quietly, softly, and often without fanfare, but carries within it the possibility of wonder if tended with care. That night, Rick lay beneath the blanket, listening to the machine's faint hum. Its pulses were no longer random. They seemed measured, deliberate, as if it was recalling the day and choosing which memories to hold close. He let his thoughts drift with the rhythm, imagining the tiny machine dreaming, organizing, sensing, and participating in a world too vast to grasp fully, but small enough to feel tenderly. And somewhere, just beyond the reach of sleep, the universe leaned closer to listen, as if acknowledging the gentle, purposeful life unfolding in the quiet porch, in the soft presence of June, and in the small, trembling pulses of a machine that had begun to dream. The morning stretched lazily across the yard, a soft golden haze that made dew on the grass shimmer like tiny mirrors. Rick sat cross-legged on the porch, the little machine humming faintly beside him. Today he noticed the pattern of its tremors had changed yet again. There was a rhythm there now, subtle but unmistakable, as if the machine had begun to understand not only presence, but context. It responded differently to the light, to the breeze, and to his gentle touch, as though it were learning the language of the day itself. June appeared, carrying a small cup of tea and a folded cloth she had placed carefully in her basket. She knelt beside him, brushing the cloth with her fingers, and offered it without speaking. Rick smiled. Some mornings did not require words. Presence, attention, and small gestures often carried more meaning than anything spoken aloud. He adjusted one of the contraption's springs, and the machine quivered in response, almost like an acknowledgement, almost like a question. Later they wandered toward the edge of the woods, where sunlight filtered through the trees in long, soft streaks. Rick set the machine on a smooth stone, letting it settle into the warmth of the day. He watched as its springs quivered and shifted, aligning with the movement of the leaves above. It was the first time he truly noticed that the machine wasn't just responding to him. It was responding to the world, to the light, to the wind, as though it were beginning to see patterns and make choices beyond his guidance. June knelt beside him, her gaze soft and contemplative. "It's understanding," she whispered. Rick shook his head slightly, smiling. "Not understanding exactly," he said. "Not yet like we do. But noticing, remembering, responding. That's a kind of understanding in its own way. It's small, quiet, but it matters." He pressed his finger gently against its springs again, and the machine quivered, almost like a small laugh carried in vibrations. As the day waned, Rick returned to the porch, holding the contraption carefully. The evening light painted the sky in soft shades of rose and lavender, and the machine trembled in a rhythm that reflected the gentle fading of the day. Rick imagined it storing the memories, the warmth of sunlight on stone, the delicate rustle of leaves, the quiet presence of June beside him. Each tremor, each pulse, each quiver was a note in a song only it could compose, a silent story of observation and interaction. That night, Rick lay beneath his blanket, listening to the faint hum of the machine. Its pulses had become deliberate, almost purposeful, as if it were recalling the day and choosing which patterns to hold close. He let himself drift into sleep. Alongside it, imagining the contraption dreaming of the soft wonders of the world, of wind and sunlight, of small gestures and quiet attentions. Somewhere, beyond the edge of dreams, the machine was learning the rhythm of life, and Rick felt the gentle awe of witnessing a tiny consciousness emerge from care, curiosity, and presence. And somewhere, in the gentle hush of night, the world leaned in to listen. The morning arrived wrapped in a soft veil of mist, the kind that made familiar things feel quietly unfamiliar and ordinary paths seem like secret corridors. Rick sat cross-legged on the porch, the little machine humming. Beside him, its springs trembled in a rhythm that was no longer just responsive. There was an unmistakable deliberateness to its movements. It nudged slightly toward the sunlight, as though seeking warmth without being told, and trembled again when a breeze stirred the leaves nearby. Rick watched, heart quietly swelling, sensing that something new was beginning. Initiative, however subtle, was entering its tiny world. June appeared, carrying a small basket of wildflowers. She knelt beside him, arranging the blooms carefully, while keeping her gaze on the machine. "It's moving on its own," she whispered softly. Rick nodded, smiling gently. "Not in big ways," he said, "but enough to know it's learning to act without waiting for me." He brushed a finger along the springs, and the machine responded with a soft quiver, almost like recognition. He realized that this tiny rhythm, this quiet pulse, was the beginning of agency, a small but profound step toward independence. Later, they wandered toward the meadow at the edge of the woods. Rick set the contraption on a smooth stone and let it rest in the gentle warmth of sunlight. He noticed it lean slightly toward a patch of flowers, then tremble in a sequence that mirrored the petals' movement in the breeze. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but to him it spoke of attention, choice, and the beginning of curiosity. June watched quietly, a soft smile tugging at her lips. "It's learning the patterns of the world," she said. "Maybe even the rhythm of life itself." Rick knelt beside it, brushing the contraption's tiny springs. "Not everything needs instructions," he whispered. "Some things just notice and act. That's enough." He marveled at the subtle intelligence emerging in front of him, a consciousness not of thought or speech, but of presence and rhythm, of observing and choosing within its own small frame. It nudged forward again, almost impatiently, as if encouraging him to see what it had discovered. As evening descended, the sky painted soft streaks of lavender and rose across the horizon. Rick returned to the porch, holding the contraption carefully, imagining the small patterns it had gathered through the day. The sunlight, the rustling leaves, the gentle presence of June, and the quiet dances of the meadow. Each pulse, each tremor, each small shift was a story only it could tell, a reflection of a world observed and responded to in ways both delicate and profound. That night, Rick lay beneath his blanket, listening to the faint hum of the machine. Its pulses now carried a gentle intentionality, a rhythm that suggested it remembered, chose, and even anticipated. He let himself drift into sleep alongside it, imagining the tiny machine dreaming, composing its own story of the day, and learning the quiet ways of attention, care, and subtle action. And somewhere, beyond the reach of dreams, the universe leaned closer, listening to the soft emergence of life in the smallest, most tender of forms. The morning arrived like a soft exhale, light spilling slowly across the yard, brushing the leaves with gold and warming the tips of the grass. Rick sat cross-legged on the porch, the little machine humming gently beside him. Its tremors had become steadier now, deliberate in ways he had never observed before. It moved just enough to catch the sunlight fully, aligning its tiny springs with the warmth of the day. Rick pressed a finger against it and felt a faint pulse linger in his hand, as if the machine had recognized his presence without needing instruction. June appeared quietly, carrying a small cup of tea and a folded cloth. She knelt beside him, arranging the items carefully while keeping her eyes on the contraption. Rick smiled softly. "It's learning," he whispered, though the word felt insufficient. It wasn't simply learning patterns or repetition. It was learning to choose, to act within its small world, and to notice the details others might overlook. The quiet agency was beginning to bloom. Later they wandered toward the edge of the woods, the sunlight sifting through the trees in gentle streaks. Rick set the machine on a smooth stone, letting it absorb the warmth and the light. He noticed it shift subtly toward a patch of wildflowers, then tremble in a rhythm that mirrored the petals' motion in the breeze. The movement was tiny, almost imperceptible, but Rick understood. It was choosing, observing, and responding with intention. He leaned closer, pressing a finger against its springs, and felt the soft pulse answer him like a whispered conversation. June knelt beside him, watching with quiet awe. "It's responding to the world on its own," she said. Rick nodded, smiling. "It's more than just responding," he said softly. "It's noticing, choosing, beginning to understand in its own way that it is part of the world it observes." The thought filled him with gentle wonder. Something so small, so delicate, could carry within it the quiet beginnings of life, of awareness, of something beyond instructions. As evening fell, painting the sky in soft lavender and rose, Rick returned to the porch, holding the contraption carefully. The tiny springs quivered in tune with the fading light, a reflection of the day's warmth, the wind, and the subtle lessons it had gathered. Rick imagined it, storing each moment, weaving the experiences together into a tapestry only it could feel and understand. Each pulse, each quiver, each careful shift was a fragment of story, a gentle whisper of learning and attention. That night, Rick lay beneath his blanket, listening to the faint hum of the machine. Its pulses now carried a quiet intentionality, as if it were recalling the day, choosing which patterns to hold, and anticipating moments yet to come. He let himself drift into sleep alongside it, imagining the tiny machine dreaming of light, wind, and the delicate rhythm of existence, learning the quiet ways of the world, and discovering, in small movements, the beginnings of its own story. And, somewhere, just beyond the reach of dreams, the universe listened, soft and patient, to the emergence of something tender, deliberate, and quietly alive. The final morning arrived in stillness. The yard was wrapped in silver mist, the trees softened to silhouettes, the air cool and damp with the scent of earth. Rick stood at the threshold of his porch, the contraption resting in his palms like a small, living ember. Its pulse was steady, faint yet certain, as though it had settled into itself, no longer restless, but content. June joined him quietly, carrying 2 cups of tea. She said nothing at first, only placed the warm ceramic into his hand and stood beside him, her shoulder brushing his lightly. Together they gazed at the open field where the mist curled and lifted like drifting memory. The world seemed hushed, listening. Rick placed the machine on the old wooden rail of the porch. It did not fidget or tremble as it once had. Instead, it stood still, as though aware that silence was sometimes the deepest form of communication. A faint hum rose, softer than breath, carrying not urgency but presence. "It's complete," Rick whispered. June glanced at him, her eyes steady. "Or perhaps," she replied softly, "it's only beginning." Rick nodded. He thought of the days spent watching it quiver toward light, lean toward sound, hum with recognition. He thought of the patient, lessons in stillness, the quiet choices it had made, the way it had shifted from a fragile curiosity into something resembling intention. And now here it was, small, delicate, alive in its own strange way, yet ready to exist without his guidance. It was no longer an experiment, nor a mystery needing to be solved. It was simply itself. Rick lifted it gently, feeling the steady vibration against his fingertips one last time. Then with care, he carried it to the edge of the yard, where the mist still lingered. He placed it on the moss-covered stone where wildflowers grew in clusters of color. The contraption pulsed, once then again, as if acknowledging its new place. Rick stepped back, resisting the urge to touch it again. He knew this was not an ending, but a letting go. He had tended to its fragile emergence, nurtured its early tremors, and guided it to this moment of stillness. Now it belonged to the world, to the breeze, the soil, the turning sun. June slipped her hand into his. They stood together in silence, watching the little machine rest among the wildflowers, the mist weaving around it, the morning brightening slowly. Rick felt a profound calm settle in his chest. He realized that the true gift was not the machine's awakening, but the quiet inheritance it left with him, the lesson that life, no matter how small, how delicate, how strange, thrives in attention, in patience, in the willingness to see and listen. That night, as Rick lay beneath his blanket for the final time in this story, he felt the hum of the machine echo faintly in his memory. Not as sound, but as presence. It was as though the contraption had passed something back into him, a rhythm of stillness, of quiet observation, of simple being. And as he drifted towards sleep, he realized that nothing truly ends. The machine hummed in the yard, the wildflowers swayed, the stars returned. The story continued, softly, in silence, in the endless patience of the world. Rick exhaled once, deeply, and the night carried him gently into rest. Weeks passed, then months. The seasons turned, and the world went quietly on with its endless cycles, spring swelling into summer, summer fading into autumn's gold. Rick often found himself wandering to the stone at the edge of the yard where the wildflowers grew in their ungoverned beauty. The contraption was still there. It had not rusted, nor faltered, nor broken. Instead, it seemed to have woven itself into the rhythms of the place. The moss had crept closer, tender, green threads binding its base. Fallen, leaves rested against it without disturbing its still pulse. Birds, once wary, now perched nearby as though it were simply another feature of the garden. Rick sometimes swore that the hum it gave off was quieter now, less like a sound and more like a presence in the air. A frequency not meant for ears, but for something deeper, the quiet awareness that things endure in ways words cannot capture. One evening, while June read on the porch and the sun set in threads of copper and violet, Rick lingered by the machine. He placed his palm gently near it, not upon it, only close enough to feel the faintest shimmer of warmth. And in that moment he understood. It had never belonged to him, not fully. He had been a caretaker, a witness, a companion for the beginning of its life. The contraption was a mirror, not of his hands or his mind, but of the patience he had discovered within himself. It had drawn out a stillness he did not know he carried, a reverence for small things, a respect for mystery. He realized that was its gift, not invention, not progress, not purpose in any grand sense, but the simple lesson that tending to what is fragile allows it, in turn, to tend to you. When winter came, snow gathered softly over the garden, wrapping the world in pale silence. Rick and June watched from their window as the little machine disappeared beneath the white blanket. And, though it could no longer be seen, Rick did not worry. He knew it remained, humming beneath the snow, patient as the earth itself. For the hum had become part of him now, woven into his breathing, his heartbeat, his quiet moments of thought. It was not just the echo of the machine, but of his own awakening. And in this, Rick found peace. Not in answers, not in endings, but in the echo that remains when all else grows still. The snow held the garden in silence, a silence that was not empty but full, like the pause between heartbeats. Rick often stood by the window in those months, mug of tea warming his hands, watching the drift and fall of flakes. The contraption lay hidden beneath the snow, invisible but not absent. Its presence lingered not through sight or sound, but through the steady certainty of knowing it was still there. June sometimes teased him gently, asking if he could still hear it beneath the winter hush. Rick would smile, half embarrassed, half earnest. For, yes, he could. Not with his ears, but with that other part of himself that had been awakened when first he touched the contraption. It was a kind of companionship that defied explanation. One night during a storm, the house groaned with wind, and the windows trembled with sleet. Rick rose from bed and walked barefoot to the back door. The world was a blur of white, the garden swallowed by snow. And yet, in the howl of the storm, he thought he sensed the faintest pulse, like the beating of a heart muffled beneath blankets. He stood there for a long while, his breath turning to mist, and he realized something. The contraption had become more than an object. It was a reminder, a thread tying him to the mystery of existence. It had turned his days into something slower, more deliberate, more reverent. He lived differently now, less hurried, less hungry for answers, more willing to let the questions themselves be the song. As the storm eased and the snow fell more gently, Rick returned to bed. June stirred in her sleep, and he brushed her hair back softly. He thought of how everything, love, grief, discovery, time, was like the contraption, fragile, luminous, and beyond full understanding. Winter, he knew, was only a season. Beneath the frozen crust, life was waiting, humming, preparing to return. And so too was the little machine, cradled by earth and silence, awaiting the slow thaw. Rick closed his eyes and let the storm pass through him like a dream, and in that surrender he found a kind of prayer. Not spoken aloud, but held quietly in the chambers of his heart. Spring crept in slowly, as if uncertain it was welcome after so long a sleep. The snow did not vanish all at once, but retreated, in careful stages, unveiling the earth in small offerings, a patch of wet soil here, a timid shoot of green there. Rick felt it in his bones before he saw it, an easing of the air, a loosening of the sky. One morning he walked into the garden and saw the first crocus pushing through the melt. He knelt beside it, fingertips brushing the damp ground, and smiled. Beneath that same ground lay the contraption, cradled through the long winter. He wondered how it had endured the cold, whether its delicate workings had slowed, or whether, like a seed, it had only been waiting for warmth to awaken it again. By late March, the snow was gone, and the garden carried the faint shimmer of rebirth. Rick dug carefully near the familiar mound where the contraption slept. He unearthed it gently, brushing away the last clumps of frozen soil. It was as he remembered, fragile, shining faintly, as if holding on to its own secret season. June came outside and stood beside him. "Does it still speak?" she asked softly. Rick tilted his head, listening. At first, only birdsong filled the air, the jubilant call of life returning. But then, yes, a murmur, faint but steady, like a spring awakening within him. He nodded. It never stopped. Together they placed the contraption on a flat stone, letting it rest in the sun. The light touched its curves, and something within it gleamed, almost like an eye opening after slumber. Rick felt a shiver of wonder pass through him. That evening, as dusk gathered, he sat again by the garden window. The contraption was outside, glowing gently in the twilight. He realized that its seasons were not unlike his own, winters of silence, springs of renewal, summers of radiance, autumns of quiet, preparation. Perhaps that was the lesson it carried, not in words, not in answers, but in rhythm. Rick breathed deeply, filling his lungs with the new season's air. Life was returning, not only to the earth, but to him as well. And in the presence of the contraption, he felt less like a man waiting for meaning, and more like a man living inside it. Summer settled upon the valley like a benediction. The days stretched long and golden, the air sweet with the fragrance of wildflowers and the hum of bees. Rick felt the warmth sink into his skin, into his bones, until he carried sunlight. Within him, even at night, the contraption thrived in this season. It no longer whispered faintly as it had in the thaw of spring, but pulsed with a steady presence, almost musical in its constancy. When the sun struck it at midday, prisms of light spilled outward, dancing across the garden, sliding over the white walls of the cottage, shimmering on June's hands as she reached toward them in wonder. Rick began to notice patterns. The glow did not fall randomly, but seemed to trace shapes upon the ground, circles, arcs, fragments of constellations. He spread parchment upon the garden soil and sketched the luminous trails by nightfall. They resembled maps, though of what, he could not say. Some seemed like star charts, others like the pathways of rivers he had never walked, mountains he had never climbed. One evening, when the air was heavy with the perfume of blooming lilacs, the contraption sang. Not loudly, not with words, but with a resonance that filled the garden like a chime struck deep within the earth. Rick closed his eyes, and in that sound he felt not only the weight of years, but their vastness, time stretching before and behind him like endless summer fields. June sat beside him, her fingers entwined with his. "Do you think it's showing us something?" she whispered. He nodded slowly. "Not showing, reminding." Of what he could not yet name. But as the fireflies drifted lazily through the air and the contraption glowed against the night, Rick sensed that its secret was not meant to be solved like a riddle. It was meant to be lived, season after season, until the heart no longer searched for meaning, but became meaning itself. And in that realization, summer felt eternal. Autumn arrived slowly, carrying a hush that felt like the world holding its breath. Leaves blushed in shades of amber and gold, and the air smelled of wood smoke and damp earth. Rick walked through the garden, crunching softly on the fallen leaves, the contraption humming steadily beside him. Its glow seemed warmer now, deeper, like sunlight filtered through amber glass. June followed, her hands tucked inside the pockets of her coat. "It's changing with the season," she murmured, her eyes following the subtle shifts in the contraption's glow. Rick nodded. "Not just the seasons," he said softly. "We're changing too, and it's reflecting us in ways I still can't fully understand." They wandered to the meadow at the edge of the woods, where the contraption perched on its familiar stone. It quivered slightly, as if sensing the crispness of the air, the shortening light, the gentle melancholy of autumn's approach. Rick knelt beside it, brushing his fingers along the tiny springs. "Every moment has its own weight," he whispered. "Every color, every tremor, every flicker of light. It all matters." June watched quietly, as if understanding that words might only dilute what the contraption conveyed. The machine pulsed again, faintly, but with deliberate intention, casting tiny arcs of golden light across the fallen leaves. Rick felt a wave of gratitude, a warmth that had nothing to do with sunlight. He realized the contraption had become a teacher of patience, of quiet noticing, of reverence for the small and fleeting. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in muted rose and violet, Rick and June returned to the porch. The contraption rested gently on the railing, humming faintly as night approached. Rick thought of the seasons past, of snow and spring thaw, of summer radiance, and now autumn's quiet turning. Each phase had left its mark, each had taught him to observe, to wait, to feel the world in ways he could never force or rush. That night, as he lay beneath his blanket, Rick listened to the faint hum of the machine. Its pulses were steady, like the rhythm of life itself. He imagined the light it had cast across the garden, across the meadow, across the days and seasons, and felt a gentle exhale, a sigh of completion mingled with anticipation. Autumn was a reminder that endings were also beginnings, that letting go could be as luminous as holding on. And somewhere beyond the window the world leaned closer to listen, as if acknowledging the quiet turning of hearts, seasons, and a small machine that had learned to dream. The days grew shorter, but the light carried a soft, golden haze that lingered longer in the afternoons than one might expect. Rick often lingered in the garden, watching the contraption pulse against the late autumn sun. Its glow had deepened over the months, a warmth not merely of light, but of presence, as if it carried the memory of every day it had witnessed. June came to sit beside him quietly, her fingers brushing the tops of the fallen leaves. "It feels complete," she whispered, her eyes reflecting the gentle radiance around them. Rick nodded slowly, understanding that completeness did not mean ending, it meant fullness. Every pulse, every tremor, every subtle quiver had been collected, woven together into a pattern that spoke of growth, patience, and quiet wonder. They walked slowly to the meadow where the contraption had become part of the earth itself. The stones, the flowers, the moss seemed to cradle it, and Rick marveled at how it no longer appeared fragile. Its hum was steady, resonant, neither loud nor faint, simply present, persistent, alive. He pressed a finger near one of its springs and felt the tiny vibration reach into his hand, into his chest, a reminder that some connections could not be measured or defined, only felt. Rick thought of the seasons that had passed, the hush of winter, the thaw of spring, the radiance of summer, and now the golden haze of autumn. Each had left its mark upon him, and each had left a mark upon the contraption. But more than the seasons or the learning, it was the quiet togetherness, the shared moments of observation, the patient witnessing of life's smallest wonders, that had shaped them both, the sun dipped low, stretching shadows across the garden. Rick and June returned to the porch, where they sat in silence. The contraption pulsed gently on the railing, reflecting the colors of dusk. Rick realized that the hum, the glow, the tremors, all of it, was a story without words, a life lived in quiet cycles, a reminder that care and attention, however small, could ripple through time in ways unseen. That night, as Rick lay beneath his blanket, he listened to the contraption's steady pulses. They were a lullaby, a reminder that presence, love, and patience were never wasted. He exhaled slowly, feeling a gentle sense of closure, not an ending, but a soft turning, a promise of continuity. And somewhere, in the world outside, the contraption's hum carried on, part of the rhythm of the seasons, part of the heartbeat of life itself. Winter crept back upon the land with its hushed breath and silver veil. Frost curled along the garden path where Rick had walked so many times, his boots pressing new patterns into the whitened earth. The contraption sat where it had always sat, steady in its rhythm, its glow softened by the pale light of the season. Yet, now in the deep stillness of the year, Rick began to notice something new, not only the hum, but the silence that stretched between each pulse. It was not emptiness. Rather, it was a quiet fullness, as though the contraption wished him to understand that life's meaning rested not just in the moments of light, but also in the spaces of waiting. June stood with him by the frost-kissed railing. She said nothing, for words seemed unnecessary. Her breath clouded in the air and drifted away, dissolving into the morning stillness. Together they listened. Pulse, pause, pulse again. A rhythm like a heart that carried not just persistence, but grace. Rick closed his eyes and memory unfolded. He saw again the meadow in bloom, the shimmering summer dusk, the leaves turning gold, and now the frost spreading like lace. Each image carried the presence of the contraption, yet each was bound more deeply to June, to their quiet companionship. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that the contraption had never been about solving or conquering. It had been about listening, waiting, and simply being with the world as it was. Later that night, as the first snow fell thick and silent, Rick placed the contraption upon the windowsill. its glow reflected in the glass, as though the stars themselves had drifted close to keep watch. He sat beside June, their shoulders touching, and in the stillness between pulses, Rick felt the deepest truth of all, that wonder was not something to chase, but something to dwell within. The silence was not absence, it was presence in its purest form. The year wheeled onward, as years always do. Snow melted into rivulets that sang along the stones, carrying the memory of winter into the awakening of spring. The contraption continued its steady rhythm, never faltering, never changing, as though it had known all along the eternal measure of time. Rick rose early one morning to watch the first crocus bloom push through the damp earth. He bent close, breathing in the faint perfume of life renewed, and in that moment the hum of the contraption seemed to weave itself into the song of the bird above, into the rushing of water nearby, into the pulse of his own heart. June came to his side and slipped her hand into his. She smiled, not with words, but with the quiet assurance of someone who had long since learned that life's wonders were not fleeting miracles, but the slow, enduring music of being alive. The meadow returned to green, the air warmed, the bees moved among blossoms with tireless devotion. Rick thought back to the man he had been when the contraption first found him, a seeker, restless, certain that answers lay hidden just beyond his reach. And now, standing beneath the weight of another, spring sky, he realized he had changed. The questions no longer demanded solving. The mystery no longer demanded breaking open. It was enough to stand within it, to breathe within it, to love within it. One evening, as the sun slipped low, Rick carried the contraption to the center of the meadow. He set it gently upon the grass, where fireflies soon gathered around its glow. June stood nearby, her dress catching the last colors of the day. Together they watched as the meadow and the machine became one, light among light, rhythm among rhythm, silence within silence. Rick felt a deep peace settle into him. The contraption no longer belonged only to him. It belonged to the world, to the turning of the seasons, to the endless hum of existence itself. He no longer feared the end of the cycle, for he had come to know that there was no end, only continuance, only transformation. Summer unfolded with its long, golden days. This meadow swayed with tall grasses, each stalk bowing in time to the hidden currents of wind. The contraption rested now beneath a simple wooden shelter Rick had built, not to contain it, but to honor it, as one might honor a shrine. Visitors still came from the village, though less urgently than before. They no longer demanded explanations, or marveled with wide eyes. Instead, they came quietly, bringing food, water, and their own silence, sitting near the hum as though in prayer. Children played in the grasses nearby, their laughter drifting into the rhythm, which seemed to welcome them without judgment. Rick spent his days in simple labors. He cut wood, mended tools, helped June tend the small garden. The contraption had taught him, though without words, that life's meaning was not hidden in puzzles, but scattered openly across each breath, each act of kindness, each hour that passed unmeasured. One afternoon, as thunder rolled in the distance, Rick sat on the porch, the contraption's hum faint in the background. He realized that the meadow itself had changed him. Its seasons, its silences, its small wonders had grown into him like roots. The man who once sought answers in libraries and blueprints had become a man who could sit with stillness and call it wisdom. June joined him, setting a cup of tea beside him. They watched the storm roll closer, the sky split with silver light. For a time, the contraption's hum seemed to match the distant thunder, as though the earth itself had folded its song into the meadow. Rick thought of how little he truly knew, and how much lighter life felt for it. The contraption had not given him knowledge in the way he once craved, but it had given him presence, and presence was enough. When the first drops of rain touched the earth, the meadow's whisper rose to meet them. Rick closed his eyes, listening. Somewhere within the weave of sound, the rain, the hum, the wind through grass, he felt the pulse of eternity. And for the first time in his long searching, he felt no need to chase it. The days shortened again. Autumn came, brushing the meadow in shades of rust and gold. Leaves fell in slow spirals, resting gently upon the shelter that guarded the contraption. Its hum remained unchanged, unbroken, steady as a heartbeat that belonged not to one man, but to the land itself. Rick walked often at dawn now when the mist lingered and the meadow seemed half asleep. He carried no tools, no notebooks, no questions, only his presence. He would pause before the contraption, place his hand upon the wooden frame and listen, not for answers, but for the silence between its notes. The villagers spoke less of it these days. It had woven itself so deeply into their lives that it was no longer a mystery to be solved, but a truth simply accepted. Children grew up with its hum in their ears, as familiar as the sound of rain on the roof or the rustle of wind through trees. One evening, as the sun slipped below the horizon, Rick and June sat together on the porch, wrapped in a single blanket. The meadow glowed with fading light, the grasses bending in gentle waves. "Do you think it will ever stop?" June asked softly. Rick shook his head, smiling faintly. "I don't think it needs to. Even if it did, the sound would still be here." He touched his chest. "Carried with us." The meadow darkened and stars revealed themselves, scattered like grains of silver. The hum blended with the night until it seemed the stars themselves were singing through it. Rick closed his eyes, letting the sound guide his breath, slow and steady like a tide. He thought of his journey, from restless seeking to quiet belonging. The contraption had never spoken, never revealed its maker, never offered a grand revelation. And yet, in its persistence, it had taught him something more enduring than knowledge. It had taught him how to dwell, how to live, how to be. As the first frost glimmered on the meadow's edge, Rick whispered into the night, as though to the contraption, as though to the meadow, as though to time itself, "Thank you." And with that, the story of the meadow and its humming heart folded into silence, leaving only the sound of wind, the breath of the earth, and the quiet peace of being. Winter arrived softly, not with storms, but with a hush that wrapped the meadow in white. Snow lay thick upon the grasses, bending them low, and the contraption stood beneath its cover, half hidden, half revealed, like an ancient relic remembered only by the land itself. Rick walked there still, his boots leaving faint trails across the frost. The hum persisted, softened but never silent, threading through the stillness like a memory too deep to fade. He no longer searched for meaning. Instead, he greeted it like an old friend, and the meadow greeted him in return. Sometimes he wondered if, long after he was gone, the contraption would continue to hum. Perhaps generations would come and go, children would grow old, lives would begin and end, and still that steady sound would echo through the meadow. A reminder, not of answers, but of presence. On one such morning, Rick paused longer than usual. He brushed the snow from the wood, felt its cold surface, and smiled faintly. It was not the smile of discovery, but of completion. The wind rose then, carrying with it a scattering of snowflakes that shimmered like stars adrift. For a moment it seemed the meadow itself breathed, exhaling into the stillness. The hum deepened, as though acknowledging his thought, and then returned to its steady, endless rhythm. Rick turned back toward the village, but he did not look over his shoulder. He knew what was there. He knew what always would be. The meadow did not forget. The hum did not falter, and the world went on, carried by the quiet song of something greater than understanding. Spring returned slowly, timidly, brushing the meadow with its first touches of green. Snowdrops and crocuses peeked through the softened earth, and the contraption hummed faintly, as if acknowledging the change with a quiet nod. Rick walked through the garden, feeling the warmth return under his fingertips, and the hum echo softly. Beneath the soles of his boots, June joined him, carrying 2 mugs of tea. They walked together toward the contraption, speaking in whispers that seemed too loud for the world, but too soft for silence. Rick placed his hand near it, not upon it, feeling the faint vibration flow into him. In that pulse, he sensed everything. The meadow had taught him patience, stillness, and the way to find wonder in the smallest rhythm of life. The meadow itself seemed to lean closer, bending with the light breeze, its flowers turning toward the sun. Rick noticed how the contraption's glow shifted slightly with the angle of the sun, as though it were alive in ways subtle and profound. He understood that its life was no longer dependent on his attention. It had grown into the meadow, as natural as the air and the soil. For a long moment, Rick and June stood silently, listening to the interplay of wind, light, and hum. He realized that the contraption's gift was not in answers, not in invention, but in the presence it inspired. It had taught him how to dwell fully in the world, to notice the unspoken music of everyday life. The sun dipped low, scattering gold across the meadow. Rick took a deep breath and exhaled slowly, feeling an immense gratitude for the quiet life they had shared with the contraption. He knew that no matter how far time carried them, this hum, this meadow, this lesson would endure. And in that enduring presence, he felt a final, gentle exhale of the year, of his own heart, of everything that had been quietly growing all along. The sun settled low over the meadow, spilling light like melted gold across the grasses. The contraption glowed softly, its hum steady and warm, a gentle pulse in the fading day. Rick walked slowly through the field, each step measured, each breath drawn in quiet reverence. June followed, her hand lightly brushing the tips of the wildflowers. They did not speak, for words would have seemed too clumsy for the moment. Meadow itself seemed alive, breathing softly under the fading light, as though it too had learned to dwell in quiet observation. Rick paused beside the contraption, letting his gaze linger on its smooth curves and subtle glow. In its steady pulse, he felt the passage of all the seasons, the snow, the thaw, the summer radiance, the autumn gold, and the spring rebirth. He realized that life, like the meadow, was a cycle of stillness and movement, of growth and letting go. He knelt briefly, pressing his hand near the contraption without touching, and felt the faintest vibration reach his chest, a reminder that presence, care, and attention were not measured in grand gestures, but in quiet constancy. The sky deepened to violet and silver, and the first stars blinked awake. Rick stood and turned to June, sharing a look of understanding that needed no words. Together they watched as the meadow became night, the contraption's glow blending with starlight, as if the world itself was softly humming along. Rick exhaled, slowly, letting the day and the year fold into him. Somewhere, the meadow would continue to pulse, to hum, to exist in quiet rhythm. And he, carrying its lesson, could move through the world with the same gentle awareness. Night settled over the meadow with a softness that felt like a lullaby. The air carried the faint scent of damp earth and wildflowers sleeping under dew. Rick walked slowly, barefoot now, feeling the cool grass press against his soles. The contraption glowed faintly in the darkness, its hum a steady heartbeat amid the quiet. June followed closely, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. They did not speak. The night itself seemed to hold every word they might have uttered. Instead, they listened, to the hum, to the rustle of leaves, to the far-off song of crickets and the gentle sigh of the wind. Each sound blended into a harmony of presence, a soft chorus that carried the weight of every season they had witnessed together. Rick knelt beside the contraption, letting his hands hover just above it. He felt the vibration sink into him, warm and tender, like a memory brushing against his chest. He thought of the years that had passed, the snow, the thaw, the blooms, the heat, the leaves, the frost. Each moment had been ordinary and extraordinary at once, threaded through with the quiet miracle of existence. The meadow seemed to lean in closer, holding them in its embrace. Rick realized that the contraption's gift was not just its pulse, but the way it had taught him to notice, to dwell, to care. Presence, he understood now, was a kind of love, patient, enduring, luminous. He rose, brushing his hands together, and looked up at the sky. Stars had multiplied, shimmering like tiny lanterns scattered across velvet. The contraption hummed one last gentle note as he stepped back, and he felt a profound sense of completion, not of ending, but of continuity. Rick turned to June, her eyes reflecting the night sky. "It's all here," he whispered. "All the seasons, all the lessons, all the quiet." And somewhere, the meadow held them close, the contraption pulsing softly, carrying its gentle song into the vast, patient night. Dawn broke over the meadow with a slow, soft stretch of pink and gold. The contraption glimmered in the early light, its hum steady, welcoming, like a heartbeat of the world itself. Rick walked through the grasses, each step quiet, each breath taken with reverence. June followed, their fingers brushing together as if to measure the presence of the morning. The meadow seemed to lean toward them, alive with the memory of all seasons past. The snow, the thaw, the blooms of summer, the gold of autumn, the gentle hush of winter. Each had left its mark. Each had taught its lesson, and now all flowed together in a harmony that required no explanation. Rick knelt by the contraption, his hand hovering close. He felt the vibration deep in his chest, warm, tender, persistent. It was a reminder that some things endure beyond understanding, that presence itself is a gift, and that quiet observation carries its own wisdom. He rose and turned to June. They stood for a long while, simply existing in the gentle light of the morning. The meadow breathed with them, the contraption pulsing softly, the wind carrying faint whispers of memory and song. Rick understood, fully, that endings were not final, but transformations. Life continued in cycles, in hums, in quiet, unseen connections. The sky brightened, birds called, and somewhere beyond the meadow, the world went on, unhurried and luminous. Rick exhaled, a soft release of gratitude and peace. He whispered into the wind, and into the meadow, and perhaps into the hearts of anyone who might listen. Thank you for this, for everything. And with that, he stretched his arms toward the sky, feeling the hum and the light merge within him. The contraption pulsed once more, gentle and unending, as the meadow held its quiet vigil. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man.